Right, Algebra 2, Lesson 3.4, Solving Quadratics, with the quadratic formula. Okay, so last lesson we learned that if a quadratic with a, b, and c cannot be factored using the x, we can solve it using the completing the square method, right? Now another option to solve quadratics that cannot be factored, right, is the quadratic formula, okay? But just like completing the square, you always want to try and use the x method first. If the x does not work, then you want to use the quadratic formula or completing the square, okay? So I've kind of outlined the general steps for the quadratic formula and how to solve using the quadratic formula here, okay? So let's take a look at example 1. So example 1 here, let's say you get this problem on like a quiz or test. You always want to try the x first, right? So as a quadratic, we're trying to solve it. It's got a, b, and c. We're going to try the x method. So a times c, that gives us -8. b is -2. So it looks like the x will work. We've got 4, right? Actually -4, +2, divided by a, which is 1. So it looks like our factors will be x minus 4, x plus 2, right? So x is going to equal 4, and x is going to equal -2. That's what's going to make it equal 0, right? So like I said, always try the x first. If the x works, right, it's the best way to solve a quadratic with a, b, and c. Don't use the quadratic formula unless you have to, okay? Let's take a look at number 2, right? So number 2 here, so if we actually try and use the x, a times c is -5, b is 3. So here, well, there's only one way to get 5, is 1 times 5. And there's no way for us to get a 3 in the middle, right? So if the x doesn't work, now we have to use the quadratic formula, right, or completing the square. Now I will say this, the quadratic formula, once you get used to it, I believe it's a better method to solve quadratics than completing the square, okay? Even though you should know both methods, because completing the square is used for to do other things in mathematics later, okay? But typically I would say that most students find the quadratic formula a lot easier to work with than completing the square method, okay? So now the steps for using the quadratic formula. Well, first of all, you have to always make sure the quadratic equals 0. That's step 1. Make sure the quadratic, right, equals 0. So it does equal 0. Step 2, you want to take out a GCF if there is one. So this example doesn't have a GCF, so we're good. Now step 3, we're going to plug a, b, and c, right? So here's our a, here's our b, and here's our c. We're going to plug them into the quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula is negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Okay? So now I'm going to plug all these values into the quadratic formula. So the negative right here is part of the equation. So make sure you always put that negative. And then what's b? B is +3 plus or minus b squared, so whatever b is +3 squared minus 4. Now I'm going to kind of multiply a times c. So if I do a times c, that gives me -5. Okay, so I'll multiply the a and the c, and then I'll just write what that answer is right here. Okay, now one thing that's very important, if you're going to calculate this using a calculator, it's very important for you to put these parentheses, especially this b squared part. Okay, so I've seen a lot of students actually do the work wrong on a calculator because they don't put parentheses. Okay, so make sure, especially if you're using a calculator, when you plug the numbers in, especially this b squared part inside the radical, make sure you put a parentheses around it. Okay, or else I'll start seeing mistakes on work. Then we have 2 times a, which is 1. Then we're going to work all this out. Okay, so basically I'm going to show all the work right here. So we're going to get x is equal to -3 plus or minus. So right here we're going to get the square root of, so 3 squared is going to be 9, right? Negative 4 times negative 5 is going to be positive 20 all over 2. So we get negative 3 plus or minus square root 29, which we cannot simplify more, over 2, and then that's your answer. Okay? Just keep in mind there's actually 2 solutions here. You should know that there are 2 answers. It's negative 3 plus square root 29 over 2, and x is equal to negative 3 minus square root 29, right, over 2. Right? But you could just leave the answer together like this with the plus minus. That's perfectly fine. Just make sure you understand that there's actually 2 solutions here. Okay? All right, so let's take a look at example 3 here. So first thing I want to do is I want to make the quadratic equal 0, right? So 2x squared plus 8x minus 6 is going to equal 0. Now notice the GCF, so I'm going to take that out. And then let's try and factor this using the x. So a times c is negative 3. I'm trying to get positive 4. So what are all the ways to get negative 3? Well, it's just 1 times 3, right? So 1 times 3, but one of them has to be negative. Okay? So if one of these are negative, we're not going to be able to get a 4 if we add them. So that means the x doesn't work. So since the x doesn't work, we're going to need to use the quadratic formula. Okay? Now, here's the thing. We have this GCF outside here, right? So what I would recommend you do is, you notice this GCF here? We can get rid of it. We just divide by 2 on both sides. These 2's would divide out, right? And we would get x squared plus 4x minus 3 is equal to 0. So by taking out the GCF, you made the numbers smaller for you, right? So when you actually plug a, b, and c into the quadratic formula, the numbers will be a lot nicer to work with. Okay, so our a is b, our a is 1, b is 4, c is negative 3. So I'm going to plug this into the quadratic formula. Okay, so x equals, so negative b, which is 4, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so 4 squared, make sure you put the parentheses, right, minus 4 times a times c. A times c here is negative 3, all over 2 times a, which is 1. So I'll work this out. I get negative 4 plus or minus. Let's multiply all this here. 4 squared is 16. Negative 4 times negative 3 is positive, right, 12. So it looks like that's going to give me square root 28 all over 2. Now square root 28, I can simplify this. This is 4 times 7. The square root of 4 is 2, right? So I'm going to get x is equal to negative 4 plus or minus 2 square root 7 all over 2. And then you have to recognize here there's a GCF at the top that you can take out to reduce with the number on the bottom. So I'm going to continue working this out. I'm going to take out the GCF on top. I could take out a 2, right? So I'm going to end up with negative 2 plus or minus square root 7 all over 2. Okay? So what I did is I just took out a 2 from here and here, right? So I factored out a 2, a GCF, and I end up with this, negative 2 plus or minus square root 7. Now the 2's are going to divide out. So my final answer will be negative 2 plus or minus square root 7. Okay? So make sure you simplify it fully when you can. Alright. Alright, let's take a look at example 4 here. Alright. So first of all, I need to make this problem equal 0. So I'm going to minus 12x on both sides. So I'll get rid of that. And I also need to add 4. Right? So that'll give me 25x squared minus 20x plus 4 is equal to 0. Now, is there a GCF? I don't see a GCF, so there's no GCF. So now I'm going to try and try to factor it using the x, right? Because the x might work. So if I try and use the x here, so a times c is 100, b is negative 20. So it looks like the x does work here. Okay, So it looks like if I go with negative 10 times negative 10, that gives me positive 100. And if I add these, I get negative 20. So the x does work in this problem. Okay? So that's why I'm telling you, always try and factor. Right? Try and solve these quadratics by factoring first. Right? So don't use the quadratic formula unless you have to. So I have to divide by a, which is 25. Okay? So this reduces to, right here, divide top and bottom by 5. I'm going to end up with negative 2 over 5 and negative 2 over 5. So my factors are going to be 5x minus 2 and 5x minus 2. Okay? So basically, when will 5x minus 2 equal 0? When x is equal to 2 over 5. Right? So basically we have 2 over 5 twice. Right? So x is equal to 2 over 5. You can just write it one time. That's fine. Okay? So example 4 here, we didn't have to use the quadratic formula. Right? So on a test or quiz, you're not going to know if the x works or not. So always try the x first and use quadratic formula only if you have to. Okay? Example 5 here. So let's make the problem equal 0. Now I know that I want a to be positive, so I'm actually going to add x squared to both sides here. Then I'll minus the 4x, minus the 4x. So that way I get 0 on the left side here. And then the x squared is positive, because I want a to be positive. I have minus 4x, and then plus 13. There's no GCF, so then I'm going to try the x now. So 13 and negative 4, so the x is not going to work. So I know I have to use quadratic formula. So x is going to equal negative, what's b? b is negative 4, plus or minus b squared, so negative 4 squared, minus 4 times a times c, which is 13, all over 2 times a, which is 1. So I'm going to work this out right here. So I get x equals, I get a positive 4 plus or minus. So negative 4 squared is 16. All right, negative 4 times positive 13, that's going to give me a negative, all right, 52. Right? So negative 52, right, and then you have a positive 16. So it looks like that's going to give you negative 36 inside a radical. Well, there's negative 36 inside the radical. You should know that, well, negative 36, right? If I keep on working this out, so this will be 4 plus or minus. I have to put the I on the outside, and the square root of 36 is 6, right? All over 2. And then there's a GCF that I can take out from the top to reduce with a 2 in the bottom. So what's the GCF at the top? It's 2. So if I take out a 2 from the 4 and the 6, I'm end up with 2 plus or minus 3i over 2. The 2's will divide out. So my final answer will be 2 plus or minus 3i. Alright, let's take a look at number 6 here. So the problem already equals 0, okay? So is there a GCF? No, there's no GCF, okay? So I'm going to try the x first. A times c, negative 4. B is 2, right? So I have 1 times 4 or 2 times 2. These are the only ways to multiply and get 4. So are we going to ever be able to get a 2 or not, right? So the x doesn't work. So there's no GCF, so I'm just going to go straight to quadratic formula. Negative, what's b? b is 2. Plus or minus b squared, which is 2 squared, minus 4 times a times c, which is negative 4, all over 2 times a, which is 4. So if I work all this out, I'm going to end up with negative 2 plus or minus. So 2 squared is going to be 4. Negative times negative is a positive 16. So I get square root 20, right? All over 2 times 4, which is 8. Now square root 20, if I simplify this, that's 4 times 5. So I'm going to end up with square root of 4 is 2, 2 square root 5. So I get x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus 2 square root 5 all over 8. Then once again, there's a GCF at the top that we can take out to reduce with the number on the bottom. So we have to make sure we do that. So if I take out the 2, which is the GCF, I get negative 1 plus or minus square root 5 all over 8, and then the 2 and the 8 will reduce. So our final answer would be negative 1 plus or minus square root 5 all over 4. Okay. Alright, number 7 here. So the problem already equals 0. It doesn't look like there is a GCF. So let's try and use the x first. So a times c, 6. B is negative 2. Alright, what are all the ways to get 6? 1 times 6, 2 times 3. It doesn't look like any of these combinations will give me a 2, so the x doesn't work. So let's go to a quadratic formula. Negative, what's b? Negative 2. Plus or minus the square root of b squared, so negative 2 squared, minus 4 times a times c. A times c is going to be a positive 6, all over 2 times a, which is 3. Okay, so let's work this out. So we get x is equal to positive 2 plus or minus. So negative 2 squared is 4. Negative 4 times 6 is negative 24. So it looks like that's going to give us square root negative 20. Now we need to simplify square root negative 20. So first of all, we got to put the I in the outside, right? So that'll make this 20 positive. Now 20 is 4 times 5, so the square root of 4 is 2. So that's going to give us 2i on the outside, and we still have the 5 inside the radical, right? All over 6. And then I see a GCF at the top that I can take out to reduce with the 6. So I have to make sure I do that. So I take out the 2, which is the GCF. 1 plus or minus I square root 5 all over 6. The 2 and the 6 will simplify. So I end up with 1 plus or minus I square root 5 over 3. That's my final answer. Okay?